Good evening and welcome to the third day of the Root and Branch Inclusive Lay-Led Synod. I am Colm Holmes, Chair of We Are Church International, and I am also a member of the Root and Branch core team. Root and Branch began in January 2020, before the pandemic. We were responding to journalist Joanna Moorhead, her challenge in the tablet that the Catholic Church needed a synod that starts with women, rather than tagging them on the end or ignoring them altogether. Very soon, as the name suggests, we understood that we needed to look at all areas of reform in the Church. As we have been joined by more and more people, it has become clear that Root and Branch is not a single issue movement. Women may have started it, but it would not end there. The pandemic lockdown and the rise in online forums allowed us to embark in October 2020 on an online journey of discernment towards an inclusive lay-led synod. We have listened to speakers from all over the world, both online and quietly in correspondence. We have been open to, we have actively sought out opinion from all sections of the Church. We have been accompanied by prayer, and we trust the guiding inspiration of the Holy Spirit. We hope that our thinking has matured and deepened, that we have become more inclusive at the same time as learning to be more bravely challenging. For months, we have been preparing the Bristol text to reform. It is a document that embodies at least some of the discoveries we have made. It exists both in a readily accessible form, which you will see this evening, and in much more complex, learned forms for those who want to explore more deeply. If you've been with us on our journey, you will have contributed in forums and breakout groups to the Bristol text, and we thank you for that. The Bristol text to reform is intended to give ordinary Catholics across the world the reassurance that there are changes we can make in our practice that are in keeping with the best of Catholic tradition and have the endorsement of deep, pastorally sensitive and well-informed thinkers and theologians. It also offers practical and often challenging visions for the Church, calling it to be Christ-like in its structures, its thinking, and its practice. So this week is the culmination of our year-long journey. This evening's panel has been preparing that part of the Bristol text that considers rethinking moral theology. Tomorrow, the fourth and final forum at 4:30 is for sharing authority. Apologies for all the different times, but we have speakers joining us from all around the world. We'll bring up the times again at the end, and you can find them on our website. Please do join us in prayer for the Synod on Thursday between 8:30 and 9:30 p.m. online. On Friday at midday, we begin our wonderful weekend firework display of speakers, both online and in Bristol, led by Mary McAleese, Helena Kennedy, and James Carroll. We will end next Sunday with a celebration of Word and Communion, followed by lunch in an agape of inclusion. But back to tonight. The format for this evening is simple. We will introduce our panel, and they will discuss the 3 short form statements they have come up with. There will be more learned backup documents, of course. Our short statements tonight are designed to be clear and straightforward and easy to manage in this medium. At the end, we will have time for the panel to answer your questions. Please email rbsynodchat@gmail.com to submit questions. That's rbsynodchat@gmail.com for questions. my colleagues Penelope Middlebow and Mary Ring will be asking the questions you send in. Naturally, with hundreds of audience members, we will only be able to tackle a sample, but there will be a survey after the synod where we'd welcome your thoughts and contributions. For now, let me introduce your chair for this evening. Joanna Moorhead was deputy editor of the Catholic Herald 30 years ago, and around the same time joined a Catholic feminist group. As a freelance journalist, she has written for the major UK newspapers, especially The Guardian and The Observer, as well as writing books. The Surreal Life of Leonora Carrington was recently Book of the Week on BBC 4, Radio 4. Joanna is arts editor of The Tablet, in which last year she wrote an article calling for a synod that starts with women. Over to you, Joanna.
Thank you very much, Colm. Very nice to meet you. And a big welcome to everybody who's joining us this evening, wherever you are in the world. This is obviously you know, everything that's going on this week is really important. It strikes me this is maybe especially important because what we're talking about here is one of the things, maybe the thing, that's going to be the lasting footprint of this event this week. And what we're going to do this evening is go through the text that's been put together, the Bristol text as it's being known, which will be offered, as Colm has explained, to the bishops and to this process that's going on that has seemed so far not to have as much space for the voices of lay people as some of us might have liked. So can I introduce now the four people who have been so far kind of working away in the last few months to put this text, to think about this text and to draft it. And they're going to speak tonight to the text. We're going to look at it in different sections and we're going to hear from each of them. So let's start with Tina, who I can see there, Tina Beattie, who is well known to listeners of Radio 4, as she is one of the voices on Thought for the Day. She's Emerita Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton. She's a researcher, she's a writer, she's director of the Catherine of Siena College at the University of Roehampton and offers that offers online courses in theology, gender, social justice. She's, as well as all her academic work, she's also a novelist. And her first novel was The Good Priest, and the second novel, Between Two Rivers, is out soon, later this year. She has many academic and media interests, but particularly she's interested in areas of sacramentality, mysticism, gender, psychoanalytic theories of desire, Marian theology and devotion, theology and art, and women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we're looking forward to hearing from Tina. Gina Menzies, I've been saying your name correctly, I'm in Scotland, so I think here it's Menzies, but I don't know if I'm, yeah. Gina is a Bachelor of Divinity, have I got this right? A Bachelor of Divinity from the Milltown Institute in Dublin, and did postgraduate studies in feminism and moral theology, and has an MSc in ethics and law from the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin, where she currently lectures in healthcare ethics. She was the chair of the Irish government's task force on women in sport, and she's a frequent guest on the Irish broadcaster RTE. She'll be well known to our Irish the people listening from Ireland today. Moving on to Thomas O'Loughlin is Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology at the University of Nottingham, and he's the Director of Studia Traditionis Theology. Maybe I said that correctly. He's a presbyter of the Catholic Diocese of Arundel and Brighton, a much sought after speaker. He's the author also of many books, including Eating Together, Becoming One, and The Rights and Wrongs of Liturgy, Why Good Liturgy Matters. And finally, we have someone who I'm told is widely known as Lockie. putting my camera onto gallery view so I can see. Hi, Lockie. Very nice to meet you. And Lockie is, in fact, John O'Loughlin Kennedy. He's a retired economist, a serial social entrepreneur is how he thinks of himself. And he's an author. And his book, The Curia is the Pope, examines what he calls the self-serving bureaucracy that manages the Pope and controls access to him. He proposes some remedies for the church in that book, which he says the church as currently managed is chronically unable to deal with. And we'll maybe hear more about that in our discussion this evening. So we're now going to go through the quite succinct words that make up the Bristol text, and for each slide, for each bit of the text, a member of the panel I've just introduced will talk to them. So here we go with the first slide, and for this we are hearing from Gina. Gina. Can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you to all those in Root and Branch for putting together this very enterprising and, I think I have to use the word, brave project. The text I'm going to read is about moral theology. The gospel speaks of a seed which, once sown, grows by itself. The church has to accept this unruly freedom of the word, appeals to unchanging laws and unchallengeable authorities stifle this creative freedom. And the second part of this text says, this calls for faith that continually evolves to meet the challenges of different contexts and cultures. As disciplines of Christian living, as disciples, Christian living is grounded in the presence and transforming power of the risen Jesus. It is at once a communal and individual response in a discipleship of equals to that call. The phrase unchanging laws and unchangeable authorities is how many of us have encountered moral norms in our lifetime in the Catholic Church. Before Vatican II, traditionalists argued that human experience should be judged by moral norms derived from moral principles. Whereas following Vatican II, or certainly at Vatican II, others argued from interpreted and evaluated human experience that we formulate norms and principles. It is really interesting that today, those of you who have caught up with the National Catholic Reporter, there is a very significant article about Pope Francis's proposed synod for 2023. And in the body of that article, a Jesuit, David McCullum, says, quote, the church organization rooted in faith needs to have a better track record than restoring to top-down authority. A very insightful sentence. Any serious reading of Vatican II would challenge us to take another path to that top-down authority. John the 23rd very clearly asked the church to read the signs of the times. And if you will allow me, I'll just quote one or two brief references to that wonderful document, Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope. In that document, it says, the church carries the responsibility of reading the signs of the times and of interpreting them in the light of the gospel. It goes on to say, the experience of past ages, the progress of the sciences, and the treasures hidden in various forms of human culture, by all of which the nature of man, himself is more clearly revealed and new roads of truth are opened, and those profit the church too. A very clear statement that the church's thinking must be open to revelations that are in other parts of the sciences. Which brings us to the main concept of this statement, historical consciousness. The relationship between history and knowledge, in other words, an awareness of the fact that we live in a particular time, place, and culture. In other words, the historical setting of our own lives, how that impacts our understandings, our experience, and also how it informs our moral thinking. The kingdom values in the gospel, the kingdom values of love, peace, forgiveness, compassion, mercy, are ones that as Christian disciples, we try to incarnate. In other words, we try to live those in our daily lives, whether that's our domestic life, our home life, our business life, our recreational life, or our political life. And moral theology mediates between these gospel values and the culture that we live in. The gospel has always had to mediate between different historical times and cultures. Some examples from human experience of how these insights have changed moral teaching I will mention briefly. The most startling one, of course, is slavery, which at one time the church totally accepted, and itself had many slaves. Since the 19th century, the church has now discarded, obviously, its acceptance of slavery. However, you know, the designation, particularly in Ireland, we're very aware of Magdalene laundries and the recent revelations. So Magdalene laundries is really a symptom of a much deeper bias against the humanity of women, where women were actually enslaved. And of course, the whole labeling of these laundries as Magdalene, after Mary Magdalene, who was never a prostitute, is in itself revelationary about the thinking behind some moral theology. Another example of how the church has learned from, if you like, the wider society is in the last document of the Vatican Council, Dignitatis Humanae, on religious freedom. The church did not accept that people had a right to their own beliefs, but that document changed utterly that church teaching. It affirmed that we have a sacred right and freedom to believe as we choose. One much more recent happening is the death penalty. The church absolutely accepted the death penalty, but in 2008, even in the Catholic in the Catechism, it changed its position on that and said that it is now inadmissible as it is an attack on the dignity of the human person. Finally, just to say that Pope Francis himself, in a wonderful biography by Paul Valéry, which I'm sure many people have read, called Untying the Knots, I think he has an insight, because in that biography, we read his life and his admission of the many mistakes that he made, and how he came to a very different position. His realization that experiences has shaped his own consciousness. However, of course, a similar awareness in how the church responds to the signs of the times has yet to be engaged in the formulation of sexual morality. The church's teaching undoubtedly has developed and is enlightened by the human sciences, and we do await such an engagement with its teaching on sexual morality. That priest that I mentioned earlier on, the Jesuit, in that article in the National Reporter today said, "It's going to be manifest when we expressed our love and affection for one another with authenticity, and when we live with the integrity of our values and behavior." In conclusion, I think the Acts 2 quotation really sums up where we are trying to get to in our moral thinking, where it says, "The faithful all lived together and owned everything in common. They sold their goods and possessions and shared out the proceeds amongst themselves according to what each one needed. They met in houses for the breaking of bread. They shared their food gladly and generously." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gina, for that. And I'm wondering if Tina, Tom and Lockie would like to come in and say any more on this slide. If not, shall we move on to the?
It would be helpful if we could see the slide, just.
Yeah. we have the slide back up again, and then it's coming. Okay, so we can see again the text about the evolution of, this is about the evolution of faith to meet the challenges of different contexts and cultures.
I'm tempted to draw a parallel. One of the things I've enjoyed this year is the realization that neatly weeded gardens and beautifully cut lawns are really quite devastating for the environment. And it's been wonderful to say, long live the weeds and the wilderness yet, and just let things run riot a little. And the project of rewilding is gaining popularity as it's realized that actually nature has a wonderful capacity to regulate itself and balance itself if we interfere less. And I sort of see an analogy with this idea of the gospel being a seed that's sown. And if we create the right environment for it to flourish, it will flourish. And we don't need to be kind of constipating ourselves with moral rules about do and don't. We just need to be mindful of what we need to create within ourselves for the seed to grow. So I think it's a really lovely image that resonates with some of the images we're reflecting on about nature and our responsibilities there. And of course, it's related. It's about a new understanding of the natural world and human nature, which isn't about control and domination, but about harmony and nurture.
That's really interesting, and also about not being afraid of things. Going back to, I've just spent time actually on a rewilding reserve here in Scotland where I live. It is very interesting, and it's partly about you know, what faith actually is, isn't it? Handing things over and believing that through, you know, what looks, as you say, like chaos, something better will emerge.
I'd like to say a word about the seed, which once sown grows by itself. I've been playing around this year with trying to grow the smallest sunflower in the world. But what has amazed me is watching them grow, that this tiny little seed actually knows when to put up a sprout and when to put out a leaf, and gradually come into bloom and provide lots more seeds. And it seems to me that the lesson from that for the church as a seed is that God puts the program into both seeds, the church and the sunflower, and we should just let it grow. That too much management and too much regulation is harmful. And maybe it springs from pride too.
Thank you very much for that, Lockie. And Tom, is there anything you'd like to say before we move on to the next slide?
Well, just it's worth always reflecting that to say that appeals to unchanging laws and unchallengeable authorities, at one level that sounds very simple, but we should also recognize just how difficult it is, because part of the mythology of virtually every religion we've ever studied is that religion is a conservative force in society. Religion is that which is the unchanging. The anthropologists will tell you that in the mythology of religion, nearly every religion will tell you its rites have been there always and everywhere the same. And so we have to recognize that there is deep within human beings this desire for a religion that acts as a sort of an unchanging force in a changing world, to quote an American general. The problem with that is that it presupposes that the universe is itself stable. And in the pre-modern world, that sort of appeal, give me that old-time religion, it was good enough for Moses, it's good enough for me, that could, in a sense, make sense. But we live in a world where we're all too much aware, not only of how we have evolved, but how fragile our evolution is. We could destroy the universe in a moment, And if we don't change, we will destroy it in a matter of decades if we continue the way we are. So we live in a very different feeling universe to those religions. And we should be aware that there's a lot of people for whom religion is just comfort. It's not challenge. And there is a warm fuzziness about nostalgia, which is very powerful and is religiously attractive and often manifests itself in the ways that religious people behave. And we've just got to recognize that.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. And I think we can, if everybody's happy, we'll move on to the next slide, to slide 2, please. When slide 2 is there, we're going to hear from 2 people on this. We're going to hear from Tina and we're going to hear from Tom. I think, Tina, are you ready to go first?
That rather than asserting authoritative moral rules to be obeyed, church teaching should be concerned with ways of thinking, helping us to see our lives as a process of continuous Christian formation along the path of wisdom, self-fulfillment and enrichment. And that last bit is a quote from Evangelii Gaudium. So that's in a nutshell what we understand by the task of moral theology. And I think part of what we're seeking to do here is to rediscover the best of our tradition, which has within it the understanding that, sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of my face. Oh, well, I can't, but never mind. The understanding that the good life is the happiest life we can live, given the limitations and constraints we're under. It's not about do this, do that, do the next thing, and at all costs don't do what you want to do. It's about learning to orchestrate our desire in a way that enables us to live in a harmonious relationship with one another, with ourselves, and with the rest of creation. And I think Pope Francis goes a very long way towards this kind of moral vision in his theology, particularly in Laudato Si. It's a vision that was in many ways distorted for Western culture by the rise of different ways of viewing the world. First, the sort of suspicion of a graced creation and sacramentality that emerged with some of the reformers, and then the Enlightenment and the shift to a Kantian moral ethics. So instead of the sort of medieval understanding derived in part from Aristotle, that the virtuous life is the life in which discipline isn't a punishment or a set of laws, but a way of harmonizing our desires in such a way that we recognize within all the good and lovely things of the world a call to desire their creator. So we don't deny our desire, but we orchestrate it, we harmonize it, and we never confuse the good things of creation with the goodness that is God and which nothing else can or should satisfy. Now, along came Kant and the age of the Enlightenment, good things in many ways, but desire and nature came under suspicion then. Nature was either an inanimate kind of functional thing to be used for human beings to exploit, and contradicting that, it was also an unruly feminine power that had to be subjugated, controlled, penetrated when necessary, but one way or the other not allowed to get out of hand. And of course, the understanding of women fell under this suspicion. It has been actually since the beginning of the Christian tradition, but we won't go into that too much right now. So instead of desire being that which calls us towards God, albeit our desire is wounded, it has suffered some primal cataclysm, and whether you ask Freud or Christian interpreters of Genesis, they come to the same conclusion, that something we imagine or experience is there before consciousness, there before we were able to decide or to commit ourselves to anything. There was something already there which made it very difficult to do what we would want to do, to be our best, because there is something about our desire that lures us in the direction of what's not good and what's not flourishing for us, for others, and for the planet. Consumerism is the apotheosis of original sin. It's the chasing endlessly after the goods of this world, which are good in themselves. But if they stop pointing us towards the goodness of God, if they begin to say that they in themselves can scratch the itch of desire and satisfy us and lead us to happiness, then we become obsessive, we become consumers. Everything ultimately gives us a little spasm of gladness or celebration or happiness, and then we get bored with it, we get disillusioned, and it's time to move on, whether that's a lover, a new pair of shoes, a holiday, or a house. And all this is about the distortions of desire. And of course, the more tragic distortions come through the abuses of addictions and obsessions. And somewhere I think moral theology needs to get us back onto track with living with the goodness of our desire, understanding desire. And this is why, for me personally, I agree that we need to do our theology in dialogue with all the sciences. But for me, psychoanalysis is one of the most helpful lenses through which to read the Catholic tradition, particularly because it does have at its core this deep psychological understanding of the nature of desire. It also posits desire as absolutely primordial. Thomas Aquinas says the only active capacity that prime matter has is desire. And I love to think that quantum mechanics suggests something of this kind of shimmering unreality almost, but bodies somehow emerge from that because of what we might call desire among subatomic particles. I won't go too far down that road, or I'm going to end up being seriously corrected by someone who knows better than I do. But there is something about learning to live in harmony with ourselves and with others, rediscovering the importance of self-love, not narcissism, not egotism, actually the very opposite, a stripping away of that anxious ego to accept the self that we are and to recognize that we often get it wrong. We're on a path and a pilgrimage together, and we learn from our mistakes. We are forgiven, we are redeemed, we are fallible, and there is no mistake so great that we can't, with God's grace, pick ourselves up and carry on the journey. But this is also why I'm very wary of any attempt to do a kind of moral theology that says we're bringing something new to the table, we're changing things, because the riches of our tradition is that there is so much there, so much that's been learned from experience and passed on to us, that we can take and bring into our own lives, incarnate it in our cultures and contexts. Again, that's absolutely of Pope Francis. And add to that our own insights, our own corrections, yes, but at the same time, we will be introducing our own misunderstandings and misjudgments. That's what life is like. That's what the messy process of pilgrimage through history is. But of course, finally, just to end in all this, unless and until the church allows its understanding of the good life to be informed and shaped by women's experiences, women's wisdom and insights, it is always going to lack an adequate theological anthropology. And if you have no anthropology, you have no moral theology, because until the church can understand the nature of women's lives, the nature of women's capacities, the female body and what it does and doesn't do, and female desire, it's never going to have anything other than a projection of men's fears and fantasies onto the muted female flesh, and women will never become incorporated fully, neither will children, There is no real theology of childhood nor of womanhood in the church so far, because those voices have only been heard and discerned through men's projections and men's authority. So we have a way to go. We have work to be done. This also affects our understanding of the environment. I think Laudato Si is absolutely magnificent, except it has absolutely nothing to say explicitly about women and issues of gender, but it's gendered through and through. And it speaks about Mother Earth somehow as a kind of suffering victim who needs to be rescued by papal knights in shining armor. Women are not helpless victims, and neither is Mother Earth. COVID, hurricanes, storms, floods, fires. Mother Earth fights back, and so do women. Women are able to defend our corner, but if the men keep refusing to listen to us, they may find that our corner has become the room and they're the ones in the corner.
Thank you.
There.
Thank you very much for that, Tina. Could we go back to the slide now, and Tom is going to talk us through the second part of it. Tom.
This moral vision is, therefore, not defined by lists of sins to avoid, but by the endeavor to live as faithful disciples in a complex world, witnessing to God's love for all creation. The good news is marked by joy, encouragement, liveliness, readiness for dialogue, patience, warmth and welcome, which is non-judgmental. That's from Evangelii Gaudium, paragraph 165. Christians, and all of us, refer continually to God. And we use this word to one another, and we use it to non-Christians, and we use it within the world as if it's a word which has meaning in the same way that that Zoom has a meaning for us tonight, that we know what we're talking about. So I think in every discourse on moral theology, we have to start with that line from one of the letters of John. No one has ever seen God. We've only seen our neighbor. Why is that a starting point? Because since no one has ever seen God, God is a word whose structure in our minds is a work of our imagination. And the question is, how healthy is our imagination by which we flesh out this word, God? The tradition has always said there are two places one could start to imagine God. The first one is power. Paul says even people who have never heard of the law, who do not even know about the revelation of God to his people, and he's referring to Judaism, can know that there is a God because they can see the acts of his power. So you can work outwards from power. There's a very simple way of doing that. I was walking into the house a couple of moments before this started, and I realized that there are ants on the front step. And before I knew it, my foot was down on them, and I had destroyed half a dozen ants or something. And there's a way of thinking, well, maybe I am to God as that ant is to me. Imagine that ant had consciousness, and that ant was aware of how much greater my consciousness is to its consciousness, and that I could obliterate it almost by accident, I would have created an image of God that is dreadful, awe-inspiring, but utterly destructive, to whom my dignity, my freedom, my reality, indeed the reality of all that I hold precious in my life, is as nothing. But Paul goes on, and Christians have always gone on and said, but we can also start with the notion of love. We can think of everything in the universe and we can think that love is greater than it. We can think of our own lives and see that that which we love is what's most important to us. And it's not an object, but it's a relationship. It's a relationship to another and to others. And we're aware that when we are loved, we are also transformed. And we know that we can no more describe love than the ant could describe me. So a fundamental starting point in any renewal of moral theology is to seek to purify what we mean by this word we throw around. God said this, God did that, God wants the other. Let's be aware just how wondrous is the mystery of God. Wondrous not in power, but wondrous because it's greater than power. And for us, that is love. And of course, that is traditionally also been seen as the weakness of Christian mission. A God that is preached as love seems a very mediocre God in comparison with a God of power. And part of the problems of our missionary endeavors, particularly since the 16th century, was that not only did Christianity come as part of a power structure, we never converted great urban civilizations with learned classes and book writing, and with great complex histories. We converted groups that we could dominate. So domination and power have entered deeply into our psyche, and we think that this is somehow a less fluffy religion. But the moment we start to imagine God with power, we destroy morality and it just becomes blind obedience or escape. So I have met atheists who went to Mass every Sunday, and they only engaged in relationship with God because God was imagined as, to use the phrase, the man upstairs. As the master was to the servant, and the servant to assert even a very basic independence and humanity, had to try and subvert the will of the master. So you paid God the minimum due and then tried to do your own thing. So we have to ask very, very profound questions about how do we imagine God? Because all we can say as Christians is what we know about God is what we see in Jesus. And thinking about how we imagine God, we then have to ask ourselves, well, are we seeking to discover and be most true to our humanity as people capable of love? and aware that we have the capacities for good and ill? Or are we just playing a game of obeying rules? Once moral theology becomes a set of rules, and there are some things that are absolutely rule-driven. This computer program is a masterpiece of rules working consistently. So I do not want the computer to start behaving erratically. And I'm sure you don't want that either. But human life is not only far more complex, but it is far richer. And moral theology not only must ask us to reimagine the absolute wonder of God, who is love, but the sheer complexity of human life and our capacity for love.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. And I just want to remind everybody who's with us that there will be an opportunity to put questions in, and I will we'll let you know again the email address that you need to send those questions to. It is RB Synod, so RB for our root and branch. It's gone. Penelope, I don't know if you can put it up again. Okay, I'll tell you that. Hold on. It's rbsynodchat@gmail.com. I was speaking too slowly. That's why it came down too quick. Thank you for that. So we'll now move on to the next slide, and speaking to that is going to be Lockie. We'll get the right slide up in a minute. Here we go. Lockie, over to you. You there?
Sorry. We're now in touch.
Is that
Bristol. Yes, it's
Great.
working.
Over
We
to you.
call for a holistic vision of the good life that is not dominated by issues of sexuality, but seeks the flourishing and dignity of the entire person. This means rejecting all forms of exploitation, abuse, and violence, and encouraging each individual to discover their personal vocation to holiness. It is our living response to the prophetic vocation to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. I want to look for a few minutes at the historical case for a new moral vision. By taking an independent line on several issues, Pope Francis has been demonstrating the extent to which normal popes have been managed by the bureaucracy. Without it, he could not begin to cope with his workload. The Curia controls access to him and rules the 5,000 bishops. The normal pope is what economists would call a captive regulator. And the Curia is the de facto government of the Roman Church. And everything else I say depends on the Curia is the de facto government of the Church. Pope Francis has stated categorically that acceptance of the Second Vatican Council is necessary if one is to be with the Church. The Pope insists that there can be no selectivity and that we must be strict on this point. His message applies directly to the Roman Curia. Nowhere has Vatican II encountered more reversals, neglect, and prejudiced interpretation than in the Curia. We find ourselves asking, are they with the church? Two important curial deviations have surfaced repeatedly during the year-long Root and Branch Inclusive Synod. One is church governance, and the other is the revision of moral theology. These are two closely linked. At Trent, Vatican I and Vatican II, there were calls for the reform of the Curia. At Vatican II, the bishop's call for collegial government was stymied by the Curia. This ensured that the call for a thorough rethink of moral theology could be ignored or resisted for the next 55 years. It would, of course, have upset the aura of generalized Roman infallibility and thus impacted curial power. Bureaucracies by nature seek to preserve themselves by seeking to enhance their power and control of their environment. If self-indulgence is the opposite of the Spirit, Galatians 5, then no Christian church should be ruled by its bureaucracy. Christian morality uniquely has a divine grounding, a principle expounded by Jesus and supported by his promise to be with the people of God until the end of the age. It goes far beyond ethics or law. When asked which was the greatest commandment of the law, Jesus said, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest of the first commandment. The second resembles it. You must love your neighbor as yourself." He went on to say quite unequivocally, "On these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets also." Matthew 22. Here, in a nutshell, he gave humanity the bedrock, the foundational principle of Christly moral theology. We are entitled to take him at his word. Therefore, if something is not related to love or the lack of it, it has no place in Christly morality. He stressed that this unselfish love must go beyond words and sentiment and must find expression in action. It is not those who say to me, "Lord, Lord," who will enter the kingdom of God, but the person who does the will of my Father. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. Even without religion, our human conscience reproves us when we put our self-interest first at others' expense. Jesus made it clear that we love God when we love others as ourselves. Francis has alerted us to the fact that this must include care for the ecology on which we all depend. At this point, a challenge to Christians individually and collectively. We must learn to be unselfish and make a habit of it. For the details of how the principle should be applied, Jesus gave us the guidance of his preaching with the example of his whole life and how he had laid it down for love of us. One would have expected Catholic moral theology to be permeated from start to finish with references back to the founding principles of Christly morality, unselfish, caring love. The links are relatively easy to see in the Ten Commandments, in the Golden Rule, and in the preaching and life of Jesus. They're often hard to reconcile with the regulations laid down by church authorities and added to the list of sins meriting punishment. Regrettably, moral theology has been shaped over the centuries by rulings from the papacy and from the canons of the local canons being decisions, the canons of the local and ecumenical councils, often in the context of resolving different issues and turf wars. When these canons were brought together as the Code in 1917, moral theology continued in its subservient role as the handmaid of canon law, and the manuals were edited accordingly. Father Prummer's condensed version of the Manual of Moral Theology runs to 500 pages, the revised canon law to another 500 pages, and the Catechism adds a further 700. While we are charged with bringing Jesus to all the nations, we have assembled a bundle of beliefs beyond the capacity of most mortal people. For all that, Catholic moral theology is still incomplete and unsatisfactory, with moral and disciplinary regulations not sufficiently grounded in Christ's teaching. The bishops at Vatican II, by a vote of 2,318 to 3, considered the state of moral theology unsatisfactory and called diplomatically but firmly for it to be renewed through a more living contact with the mystery of Christ and the history of salvation. Special care must be given to the perfecting of moral theology. Its scientific exposition nourished more on the teaching of the Bible. Quote from Octatum Totius. By their sheer volume, if for no other reason, the man-made regulations have tended to obscure rather than proclaim Christ's moral principles and his directives, not to mention the way of doing things. Christ is forgiving, merciful, and patient, and he never overrides the freedom of decision on which our capacity to love depends. In contrast, churchmen tend to enforce external compliance with regulations, resorting routinely to coercion, despite the teaching that there should never be coercion in matters of religion. Jesus wants mature, discerning people whose decisions and actions spring from unselfish love. Too often, moral theology has focused on sin, obedience, and punishment, even to the point of creating and upgrading some special sins exclusively for Catholics. This has trivialized the whole concept of morality. This trend has been nurtured by the two dogmas adopted in 1870 at Vatican I. Universal jurisdiction gave the papacy immense power, while the Curia exploited by exaggerating infallibility far beyond its defined limits. The dogma that the Pope is infallible under certain conditions has only been used officially once, but has been widely abused to provide an aura of infallibility for teachings that are far from infallible, and to block reforms that would better align the visible Roman Catholic Church with the mystical body of Christ, the real church to which all the baptized belong. Expanding on the Great Commandment, Jesus added two specific mandates for his followers. One was that we should commemorate him by doing this, in a re-celebration of the Last Supper, and the other, that we should make disciples, that is, people who love, of all the nations. Regulations inherited from different times and circumstances are currently working against both of these mandates. Converts in mission territories have long been forbidden to do this. Although a priestly people, they must wait for ordained officials who are in very short supply. The regulations here are taking priority over the main mandate. Make no mistake, Jesus anticipated the development of some form of hierarchical organization among his followers. when he instructed them on how they should behave in positions of authority. They were not to lord it over their subjects as the pagan rulers do. The greatest should be the least. They were to be servant leaders. The trappings of monarchy for the Pope and his surrounding court are thus in conflict with Christly morality, as are crowns, tiaras, fancy clothes, red shoes, and elaborate rings that speak of pomp and signify power. But these have never found their way into the list of sins. The night before he died, Jesus prayed that his followers would be united by love. This was forgotten for centuries while leaders tortured and burned other Christians who were not as orthodox as they and who would not profess what they did not believe. We pray every day to be spared temptation and for forgiveness when we fall. Regulations demanding the lifelong vows of chastity as the condition of ministry have created powerful and continuing temptations for people who set out to devote their lives to God. It has proved overwhelming for a significant proportion and soul-destroying for their victims. This has been known and tolerated by the papacy, which kept it a secret successfully for centuries. From 1922 to 2019, successive popes confirmed the automatic penalty of excommunication for bishops who failed to suppress the truth about clergy sex abuse. The bishops are now being expected to take the blame for the cover-ups in a futile effort to cover up the papal contribution to the worldwide disaster. By continuing to prioritize its own reputation, regulations, and pseudo-infallibility ahead of Christly morality and the truth, the papacy has forfeited its integrity and its right to preach to anyone about morals. Notably, Jesus never called for a celibate ministry, but appointed married men as his apostles to preach, Mark 3:14. In fact, he never ordained a priest. He never ruled out women for priestly or administrative office. He never approved the mutilation of young boys to provide the high notes in the choir, while the authorities, who base so much of their moral teaching on natural law, ungraciously spurned God's gift of natural sopranos and mezzos by banning women from the liturgy. There was no reason for this discrimination, except the bias and the surrounding culture which denied women in general the possibility of eminence and dignity.
Lockie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for this. And
that's great. Okay.
Particularly from me for the things you're saying about women, but all of that is so interesting. I think that we have some questions. I'll just remind you again that the place to send those to, if you have a question, is rbsynodchat@gmail.com. I hope I got that right, Penelope. And Penelope Middlebow is now going to, I think, share some of the questions, and the panelists are going to come back in and talk, answer them and talk about the issues that the audience have raised. We're all coming back together on the screen, I think. And Penelope's there, so I'm kind of handing over to you, Penelope.
Hello. And Mary's also doing some questions, and she's got a very good one, but I've got a quick one that came in. We all know the quote from the Bible, "What you allow on earth will be allowed in heaven." Does this mean that morals change all the time? Is nothing fixed at all?
Oh, human nature is fixed, and human nature is fixed to an extent that that annoys us. But human nature is fixed within a society, and within a society there are levels of understanding. So it's seeking out the truth, which is an engagement that we as people engage in now that is the important thing, rather than thinking that there are there's a quarry of knowledge, whether you call it the Bible or the tradition or the scriptures, and that's an attempt to outsource our moral responsibility either to a book or to a list.
Thanks so much, Todd.
I find myself thinking of W.H. Auden's words, what will survive of us is love. I think whatever heaven might be, and I don't think it's something in another realm, it's something that breaks through the cracks of the here and now all the time. Love has to be the guiding dynamic that orientates our lives, and cultures, languages, traditions change. I mean, that's part of our own tradition, that customs and cultures are incarnate. They are manifestations of Christ's life. But what will survive of us is the love we brought to those things. And that's not glib, that's not marshmallow love. It's really challenging. And I don't think very many of us get it right. So thank God we're forgiven too.
Thanks, Gina. Gina, did you want to say anything?
Well, I suppose a phrase that just comes to mind is that we're not on a linear path, that there's something like the kingdom breaks in every now and then. In other words, the kingdom values break in every now and then. And the phrase that comes to mind is the already and the not yet. In many ways, we have reached some part of our destination, but maybe the entirety is way beyond and will never be there. But that doesn't negate the journey.
Thanks so much. And Penelope, I think you're going to come in now with another question, or
Yes.
maybe Mary.
Yes, I'm coming in. Thank you, Joanna. This question says, if there be a theology of men, may we assume that this is seen as the normative theology of human beings? Tina says that such a theology of women, children, as exists, has been mediated through the lens of men. Many male theologians will not agree that their insights into female existence are in any way invalid. Perhaps what we need is a theology of men created by women, i.e. mediated through the lens of women, which allows for all the fears and worries women have of men. We then present this to the men and show them that that is how we really see them.
I should just add, by the way, when I say men, I don't mean a blanket generic category of everyone who belongs in that category. I am talking about a hierarchy that is a celibate male hierarchy that forms church teaching, and rather a large number of lay people who contribute to that, and not just men. I mean, women too, for complex reasons, often do collude in the patriarchy. If I were in Afghanistan right now, I'd think patriarchy was better than what they've got. So, I think we have to be nuanced about the struggles people have and what supports them. But yeah, a theology by women, I won't mention this. There's something that's going viral on social media, which I find highly entertaining, which is a little glimpse of a very witty theology by a woman of men, particularly to do with the recent ruling in Texas. But if you want to see what that is, go and find me on Twitter, because I shared it.
Thanks for that, Tina. Sorry, I can't remember who we've heard from. Tom, and we've heard from Tina on this question. Do either Lockie or Gina like to say anything?
Whereas I think it's a very interesting way of highlighting the issues of a male anthropology, which has dominated society as well as the church, and manifests itself in the form of patriarchy. I'm not sure it's the way to go. I think a human theology is perhaps what we need, that is all embracing, because men and women, I've always disliked the harsh categorization of women think like this and men think like that. Now, I take what Tina is saying absolutely, that, you know, particularly moral theology has been dominated by a small group of humanity. But I don't think all men think one way and all women think the other way. I think there's a much greater crossover between the genders in their thinking and their approach to moral thinking as well.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that, Gina. Penelope, are you coming in now?
Yes, I am. Someone is saying most discussion is focused on the formation of individual morality. What about the moral theology of corporations and institutions, particularly when these entities often are now considered persons by civil courts with the same rights and protections, but not necessarily the same obligations as human persons? Could the speakers comment on this modern context with respect to moral theology?
Organizations are pathologically selfish. And the idea, to me, of having a bureaucracy that's running the church without adequate supervision, they're the only bureaucracy I know that doesn't have to answer to a board of directors or a government or some such. And that means that their selfishness gets free rein, and they're very careful to protect themselves from criticism. And the weakness that keeps coming up in this conversation about, you know, the patriarchal inability to understand women is hopelessly complicated by the fact that all the people who are in decision-making positions are celibate. And whatever chance a married man has of understanding marriage, there is no way celibate people can experience it. If they experience sex, it's because they're breaking the rules and there's no commitment and so on. But I do think that this division, in a sense, between the lay and the ordained is worse than the division between the women and the men.
I think, thanks so much for that, Lockie. I think that the question there was around wider institutions, not just the church as an institution. I don't know if anybody else would like to come in here. Gina.
You know, just very, very briefly, yes, that's what I heard the question talking about, if you like, communities. And I think I very briefly referenced community at the beginning. I said the call is an individual and a communal response. I think what is interesting in society now, if you like, in the social world, almost all the organizations that I encounter and I'm in touch with, they all have a significant, if you like, segment of their management which is now devoted to ethics. It's almost mandatory in organizations now that they have an ethical stance in relation to all aspects of their work. And the other thing that strikes me as really interesting, I can't give you the exact quote, but there's a very brilliant theologian in the US, Mary Hunt. I'm sure many of you know about her. And she has written quite extensively about the value and the richness of diversity in organizations. And then she transposes that into, if you like, church teaching. But she absolutely, you know, proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that organizations which embrace diversity, do not have groupthink, are far more successful, not just financially, but in every other respect as well. And I think that concept of diversity is one that we really need to embrace again in our moral thinking.
Thanks so much, Gina. Shall we move on to another question?
Thank you.
Yeah, that'll be Mary coming in with that.
This questioner says, at the National Pastoral Congress in Liverpool, half a lifetime away, we discussed in groups, hierarchy, priests, religious, lay people. Coming through time and time again was the Sensus Fidelium. The document, The Easter People, was produced and endorsed. Bright Future soon disappeared, probably frightened Rome. Have the panel any confidence the forthcoming synod will be any different?
Interesting question there. Who'd like to speak to that one first? We've all got something to say about that.
Well, I would think that Pope Francis has changed the atmosphere enough that the sensus fidelium, when it tries to express itself, will have to be at least heard, if not listened to.
Great, thank you. Tina, any thoughts?
I mean, I'm thinking back to 2015 and 2018 when the Catholic Women Speak Network edited 2 collections of short essays and narratives by women. The first time by miracles and the second time by consent. We managed to get 350 copies of the book into the Synod Hall so that there was one for every participant at the Synod to take away. But we also, through the generosity mainly of religious communities and individuals, we managed to have 2 international events at the Pontifical University Antonianum in Rome to coincide with the start of the Synod. We were advised by one of the Pope's right-hand men to invite all the bishops and cardinals to make sure that we made clear that we were collaborating with them and not going it alone. We had one response saying can't come, the hours it took to send those invitations. And I think we had a couple of bishops did do us the courtesy of saying they'd taken the book and read it and thank you very much. But I think the problem is not Pope Francis, it's what Lockie was saying, it's the control of the Curia and the unholy wars raging in the church at the moment between, you know, uber conservatives and the rest. And Pope Francis has a huge challenge on his hands. So I think a great deal depends on how many people there are in Rome willing to put their heads above the parapet and create a space for other voices to be heard. And I'm sorry, but I just think that in many bishops' conferences, including our own here in England and Wales, they are afflicted with defeat by the authoritarianism of the last 2 papacies, and they've forgotten how to stand up and say, not in my name. And they have the authority. Pope Francis has given them the authority. I really, really hope they will use it and listen widely, not just in this country. We need all the voices of people around the world in their diversity, in their difference, in their struggles to be heard. And only the bishops' conferences can do that because they've been given the authority to do it. Now it's up to them and to us. And if they don't listen to us, well, their last shreds of credibility and authority probably disappear, but I don't know. I don't understand.
But the bishops have an invidious choice. They're caught between Francis, who is mortal, and the Curia that they will have to deal with when Francis is gone. And the Curia have ways of making life intolerable for a bishop if he doesn't play ball. The multiple permissions and derogations and so on that must be sent to Rome and got back. And they can just be long-fingered, and the bishop is in trouble with his people because the request for a derogation hasn't been dealt with. And they can turn the pressure on. So the bishops are in an impossible position. And as long as the Curia runs itself, that unfortunate situation will continue.
Thanks so much, Lockie. Do we have time for one more question? Penelope and Mary? Yes, we do. We have one more question coming up.
This year marks 40 years since the first cases of what came to be called AIDS. Since then, millions have died, and today 38 million people live with HIV/AIDS. This was embodied within particular communities, not least women, but LGBTQ people and Black people. Questions of the panel: how has the ongoing HIV pandemic contributed to the development of moral theology? And I assume he means in this church.
I think one of the sad things is that it's contributed very little, because the tradition of moral theology that most people have been trained in is a very deductive notion of theology. There are basic principles and then you just work them out, almost in the way you work out a mathematical problem. And that means that you then try and fit reality into that moral theology, rather than looking at the whole issue of what's going on in people's lives and helping the people themselves to discover the good. So I think, unfortunately, it's been a massively missed opportunity.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that. We've got one more question that I know Penelope and Mary are keen to get in before we wind up. So sorry to cut you short on answers to that, but let's just quickly hear the final question.
It says, the church sadly excludes people who do sinful things. For example, priests who have a relationship with men. Whatever happened to forgiveness?
Well, that says it all. I mean, and it applies to many other areas. I suppose you could put it in the context of sexual morality. I think the church's teaching on sexual morality is massively impoverished. And, you know, when you compare that to the body of social teaching, which I think, going back to my earlier comments, seeks and acknowledges the insights of, Tina said, psychotherapy, but psychology, sociology, philosophy, history, and takes those on board and produces very nuanced documents, particularly in the last 100 years. But none of that is taken into the sexual moral teaching. And as Tom said, the HIV/AIDS, there's a complete disconnect between the reality of people's sexual lives and, you know, what the church, well, what the magisterium preaches. And I think, going back to the sensus fidelium, the sensus fidelium is now way ahead of the magisterium in relation to human relationships that are fruitful and fulfilling and contribute to human flourishing.
Thanks so much, Gina.
I really don't want any more absolutes or any more reasons to exclude people for anything. But I do find it interesting that, for example, for a Catholic to work in an abortion clinic would be almost impossible given the strict ways in which the rules are applied. And it's interesting that capital punishment, war, the arms trade, the abuse of the poor all now stand under the sort of indictment of church teaching. But when do we see people threatened with the heavy arm of the CDF for working in the arms trade, for running businesses? This is back to the morality of corporations, you know, for running businesses which trample the poor into the dust, politicians who promote policies which create a huge abyss between rich and poor. So, you know, it is all about sexuality and morality, sexual morality. And I'm afraid, again, it comes back to women and men who behave like women by desiring men instead of women. You know, it all comes back to that narrow, obsessive preoccupation with no psychoanalytic, no psychotherapeutic understanding, no scientific understanding of the huge complexity of who we are and what we desire.
No sort of relational kind of context to much of this, and decisions being made about where the lines are drawn, as you say. Are we moving? I'm conscious now that when I can see that my face is in shadow, because when we started talking this evening, I was sitting in the Scottish sunlight, which is not as unusual this year as it has been recently. Actually, we've had an extraordinarily good summer in Scotland. However, the sun has now gone, and I'm sorry I didn't plan ahead so that I had a light around the front of me. thank you very much to all our panelists for so many interesting thoughts and insights. It's been great sharing with you this evening. And thank you for the privilege of being asked to be part of this. I'm very much looking forward to coming to Bristol in person on Friday and meeting some of you who will be there for the in-person part of this conference. For myself, I have to say, I live in a community of young people, my own children and their partners and sometimes their friends. And the only way I can go and sit, so some of my own children were all raised as Catholics, their partners, some of them are Catholics, some of them are not, some of the friends are Catholics, some of them are not. But I could not go and sit at the table in our kitchen and share the meals that we have if I wasn't able to say the reason what I'm doing as a Catholic is trying to change the church. I would have zero credibility among my community of young people who are teenagers and young people in their 20s if I wasn't able to say that. So thank you for allowing me to be part of something that is trying to make the changes that we all believe are necessary. Can I also just let you know that the statements for the Bristol text that we've been discussing this evening will be available on the website, and we'll be keeping the organisers of the synod will be keeping the text alive during the weekend synod and giving a final roundup on it on Saturday before the close of play. There won't be voting on this, however, a survey sent to ticket holders to assess their priorities for reform. So you will get a chance to say something there. And the statements will then be sent, as has already been said, around the world for other reform groups like this one to sign up to, share their own thoughts on, and then feed into the synodal process for the Synod of Bishops, which so many of us feel, from what we know of it, is not quite primed yet to take account properly of the voices of the people. Finally, I just want to tell you that tomorrow's panel, tomorrow's virtual panel like this one, is at the earlier time of 4:30 British Summer Time, 16:30 British Summer Time. And we're now going to just go through the slides again, I think, just to remind ourselves what we've been discussing. Thank you all very much indeed. It's been a really interesting evening. Good night.
I myself will dream a dream within you. Good dreams come from me, you know. My dreams seem impossible, not too practical, not for the cautious man or woman. A little risky, perhaps, a trifle brash, sometimes. Some of my friends prefer to rest more comfortably, in sounder sleep with visionless eyes. But from those who share my dreams, I ask a little patience, a little humour, some small courage, and a listening heart. I will do the rest.
You will meet me often as you work, in your companions who share the risks. Sorry, I can't see. Sorry, you will meet me often as you work, in your companions who share the risk, in your friends who believe in you enough to lend their own hands, their own hearts to your building, in the people who will stand in your doorway, stay a while and walk away knowing that they too can find a dream. There will be sun-filled days, and sometimes it will rain. A little variety, both come from me. So come now, be content. It is my dream you dream, my house you build, my caring you witness, my love you share. And this is the heart of the matter. Good night.